So as the emotion regulation field has developed over the years, there's been a greater appreciation for the importance that context has in determining the regulation strategies that people choose and the efficacy of those emotion regulation strategies. A number of lab studies have demonstrated pretty consistent relationships between things like cognitive load and strategy choice or strategy effectiveness. One of the more mixed results has been the affective intensity of an experience, in which strategies are most effective or which strategies people tend to use. I think pretty reliably, it is the case that reappraisal tends to be more effective at meeting one's regulatory goals when the affective experience is relatively low in intensity. And then disengagement strategies like distraction or suppression tend to be a little bit more effective when the affective experience is relatively high. Some lab studies have demonstrated that unprompted people will, or undirected rather, people will follow along these lines. But it's also the case that lab studies necessarily remove a lot of the complications that exist within emotion regulation, in day-to-day life. In reality, most people are strategy naive. They're not trained in what reappraisal is, what distraction is. They might not classify it in that way. They don't choose just one strategy. They might experiment with multiple strategies as the selection, optimization, and compensation framework goes. And they're often unprompted to regulate. Nobody, as somebody cuts you off in traffic, is telling you, hey, remember to, regulate your emotions. So it might be the case that in these lab studies, what we're really measuring is forecasted choice rather than actual choice. It might be the case that we're stuck within the realm of theory rather than how it might exist in the real world. And there's a number of EMA studies that have done a really good job of this, but what we wanted to do was take a more localized look at these experiences within a semi-controlled environment, but outside of the context of a lab. And that's what we did with this series of experiments. So in 2019, we asked 54 participants to go through a haunted house experience at Eastern State Penitentiary here in Philadelphia. For those that don't know, Eastern State Penitentiary is a nationally renowned haunted house. It's really elaborate, really over the top, but very controlled, very consistent night after night. And they worked with us tremendously to ensure that we had as much control over the environment that people went through as possible. We were allowed to be the first to go through night after night to ensure consistency. And, all actors were aware that we were part of a study, so they tried to basically do the same thing night after night, which was nice. But so those participants went through the haunted house, and then we asked them afterwards, whether letting them know ahead of time that we want them to identify 10 events from that haunted house that were emotionally salient to them. We asked them to describe those events. We asked them to denote which emotions they felt, how intense those emotions were, and if they attempted to change those emotions in any way, describe how they attempted to do that. After we collected that data, we got 2 hypotheses blind raters to classify those strategies according to the process model. So they went through all of those regulation descriptions, and they either classified them as reappraisal, distraction, suppression, some combination of those, or none of the above. Once we got those ratings, we then parsed through them, and we identified 88 events from 34 participants that used only reappraisal or only distraction. And we collected those into a new stimuli set, more or less. We then recruited 218 people from Prolific, and we presented them with these events. We gave them the description of the event. We told them what emotions were experienced, and we told them how intense the emotions were. And then we gave them descriptions of reappraisal and distraction, and we asked them to try to forecast what they would have used if they had experienced the event. With the idea being that, if people really are, using these ideal strategies, there would be quite a bit of consistency between those who have actually experienced the event and the forecasters who are trying to predict the event. After exclusion criteria, we had 152 participants, and they responded to all 88 scenarios. So the primary hypotheses for this examination was that affective intensity would not be associated with strategy choice selection among experiencers. And again, the idea being that the lab studies might not model all of the complications that exist when we are trying to look at emotion regulation within the field. You know, people might have had an off day. They might have particular strategies that they default to. They might not be very great at reappraising in the moment, you know, things like that. But when we remove all of those complications, it might be the case that we do start to see a relationship between affective intensity and the likelihood of selecting a given strategy. Again, following those lab studies where disengagement works better for high intensity and engagement works better for low intensity. And that's exactly what we found with our results. So if you look in the middle here, you will see that like we've got this gigantic standard error bar here for these binary logistic regressions. And we did not find any significant strategy, any significant relationship between strategy choice and affective intensity, but we did find a small effect among forecasters. So again, you know, this is the people who actually went through the haunted house and what strategies they reported using in that time. And this is the plot for those who had predicted what they would have used given that. Of note, though, there was a discrepancy, or I'm sorry, not a discrepancy, a significant difference in how frequently strategies were used within this data set. So reappraisal was far less common than distraction. But interestingly enough, when we look at whether or not the forecasters accurately predicted what the person used, reappraisal was more accurate as determined by a chi-square test. So, you know, these are still very preliminary. Our results may suggest a discrepancy between affective regulation forecasting and affective regulation action exists. And this relationship was consistent after we had adjusted for ERQ scores, difficulty in emotion regulation scores, gender, age, and depression. We also examined this relationship separate from mono strategy. So we looked, once we include all, I think, 400 some events, this relationship still did not hold up. But unfortunately, we weren't able to pass this on to forecasters to get their results on this. But you know, that being said, we did run a follow-up haunted house study this year, and we had a much larger sample size, 120 participants who went through the entire thing. We also added new measures to capture emotional goals. We captured cognitive load and several other relevant variables. So we're really excited to follow up on this and hopefully publish something soon.